Welcome to the second lesson in our video series that's exploring the topic of God's existence. In this lesson, what I want to do with you is consider whether or not belief in God is a reasonable, logical, rational thing, or if belief in God is just like taking a blind leap of faith, and that it really isn't that reasonable or logical or rational. Dr. William Lane Craig made some comments on a C.S. Lewis quote. C.S. Lewis once remarked that God is not the sort of thing that one can be moderately interested in. And so Dr. Craig said, after all, if God does not exist, well, there's no reason to be interested in God at all. On the other hand, if God does exist, then this is of paramount interest. And our ultimate concern ought to be how to properly relate to this being upon whom we depend moment by moment for our very existence. So people who shrug their shoulders and say, does God exist? What difference does it make? Merely show that they haven't yet thought very deeply about this problem. It's akin to a car, and I'll explain why. I look at my car, and I love my car, by the way, but I look at my car, and the reasonable, rational, logical conclusion is that my car was designed by somebody, that it was engineered, that it was built by trained craftsmen, and that it was built in a factory somewhere. That's the reasonable, logical, rational conclusion. But you ask why? You've never met the designer. You've never seen the engineer. You've never seen the craftsman at work. You've never been to the factory. So why is it more reasonable to believe that my car was designed and engineered and built than to say that my car just happened to come together because a bunch of parts fell from the sky? Why is it reasonable to say that it was built by trained craftsmen and not by an army of chimpanzees? Why is it more reasonable to say that it was built in a factory and that it didn't just come together in the middle of a wet jungle? Why is that the reasonable, logical, rational conclusion to come to? Well, we approach God in the same way. Is belief in God just taking some blind leap of faith? Take 2 Corinthians chapter 5, for example. If you've got a Bible handy, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in the New Testament, you'll notice here in verse 7 of that chapter, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, it says that we walk by faith and not by sight. Unfortunately, this verse has been rather absurdly misapplied by a lot of people, even in the religious world. Even deeply religious people will look at this verse and say, see, faith is not rational. Faith is not reasonable. Faith is not logical. Faith is a blind leap that you take into the unknown. We don't know whether or not God exists. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. Faith, my heart, tells me that he exists. And so I move and live and exist based on that empty, blind faith in God. Now that's silly. That's absolutely silly. Even theologians like Hans Kung, for example, upheld this idea when he wrote, even in faith then, there is no certainty entirely free from doubt. In faith, we must commit ourselves to something that is uncertain. A televangelist, Robert Schuller, once suggested that faith is a commitment to an unprovable assumption. And here's the sad thing, that if these men are true, if faith is merely the acceptance of something that cannot be proven, then it makes faith in God just nothing but a curiosity. It means that faith in God really has no bearing on how I live or how you live. It's like believing in Santa Claus. You can believe in Santa Claus if you want to, and that has no impact on me. Believing in Santa Claus has no practical impact on the people around you. If you want to believe in the Easter Bunny, fine, that's okay. Believe in the Easter Bunny. You're a lunatic if you do. Is faith in God basically the same thing as believing in the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy or dragons and unicorns or Santa Claus? Is that basically what faith in God is? I think that's one of the great objections that atheists have to belief, is that when they see even believers falling for this trap that faith is just some blind leap, that belief in God is just a hopefully so, crossing my fingers, maybe it's true. When atheists see that even believers have that kind of belief, then I think it gives the atheist all the ammo that he or she needs to just say, well, if that's what faith is, I guess I just don't have enough faith to believe in God. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 is not talking about taking a blind leap. When the Apostle Paul says that we walk by faith and not by sight, he's not saying that God is just so unprovable, that God is so abstract, that God is so ethereal and superficial, that we just kind of have to close our eyes and hope he's there. That's not what the Apostle Paul is saying. There's something deeper going on. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 is actually amplified by other verses in the Bible, like Hebrews 11 verse 1. Go a little bit further in the New Testament. And you go to Hebrews 11 verse 1, and this gives us another definition of faith that I think is really concrete and very powerful. The writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11 verse 1, "Now faith is the assurance of things that are hoped for and the conviction of things that are not seen." That's not talking about taking a blind leap. It's assurance, not maybe or God might exist or he could exist or I sure hope he exists. It is the assurance that God exists. It is the conviction of things that are not seen. I am convicted and absolutely convinced that my car was designed by somebody or a team of somebody's, that it was engineered to work a certain way. I am convicted and 100% convinced that there were trained craftsmen who had their hands in making that car. And I am convicted that my car was made in a factory and not in a wet jungle by chimpanzees. No, I've never seen any of those things. I've never laid my eyes upon any of those things. It is the assurance of things that are hoped for. It is the conviction of things not seen. That is faith in God. That's faith in God. But the thing is, even the context itself, back there in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, even the context itself bears this out. Go back to 2 Corinthians 5 and notice a little bit further in the chapter where it says in verse 16 of that same chapter, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 16. The apostle says, "Therefore from now on we recognize no man according to the flesh. Even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him thus no longer." In other words, in the past, Jesus had been present in the flesh. And you could believe in Jesus by sight. You could literally see Jesus. There were witnesses after the resurrection of Jesus who saw him, who talked to him, who walked to him. Thomas, for example, one of Jesus' own disciples, not only laid his eyes upon Jesus, but was able to put his hands upon Jesus and feel for himself, physically, the wounds in his hands and the wound in the side of Jesus where the spear pierced him. Now, we call Thomas Doubting Thomas, and I think that's a little bit unfair. You know, when you look at Thomas as he's portrayed in the Gospels in his entirety, Thomas is hardly a doubter and a skeptic. But by John chapter 20, Thomas felt like he had reasons to be skeptical that Jesus was raised up. And he said, "I'll believe in Jesus when I can put my hands upon him, when I can see with my own eyes and feel with my own hands the wounds that were inflicted upon Jesus Christ." Jesus made an interesting point there in John chapter 20. In John chapter 20 and verse 29, Jesus is talking to Thomas. After Thomas is able to lay his hands upon him and see him with his own eyes, he says, "Well, I believe now, Jesus." And Jesus said, "Okay, all right. Because you've seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That's what we're talking about here. We walk by faith and not by sight in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 16. We once saw Jesus. Jesus was in the flesh, and we believed in him because we saw him. We behold him thus no longer. Now, maybe you believe that your car was built by craftsmen in a factory because you actually got to go to the factory. Maybe you own a Corvette and you got to go up to Kentucky and you saw the Corvette factory and you saw them building your Corvette and you saw it roll off the assembly line and you got to sit in your Corvette for the very first time. You smell that new Corvette smell and you believe that your Corvette was built in a factory by craftsmen because you actually saw it being built. Great. You believe based on sight. You got to see it. But is your belief in your car's origin any more legitimate than my belief in my car's origin simply because you saw it rolling off the assembly line? I didn't see my car roll off the assembly line, but I believe just as much as you do, with just as much conviction, that my car also rolled off the assembly line. Thomas believed in Jesus because he saw Jesus. Peter, James, John, they believed in Jesus because they actually saw Jesus. And Paul is saying here in 2 Corinthians 5, we believe in Jesus not because we saw him, but because we have faith in him. We walk by faith and not by sight. Is that belief any less legitimate simply because I have not personally laid my eyes upon Jesus? We can have genuine faith without sight, thanks to a number of different things. Credible witness testimony, reliability of the scriptures, biblical prophecies that have come true, and the rational, logical conclusion that God exists and fits the description of who God is that's given in the Bible. There is no other religion, there is no other conception of God that so perfectly matches the written description with the rationally derived and necessary definition that we're going to consider here in just a moment. Faith does not require sight. Take 1 Peter chapter 1, for example. Later on in the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. Peter, who got to see Jesus, by the way, whose faith in part was based on sight, had this to say to these original recipients. In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been distressed by various trials, that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And though you have not seen him, you love him. And though you do not see him now, but believe in him, you greatly rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, obtaining as the outcome of your faith the salvation of your souls. Now, if you're a skeptical person, all of this sounds very easy. All right, Ryan, you already believe in God, and you're using scriptures in a God that you already believe in from a book that you already believe in to try and prove something that you already believe. That's easy, Ryan. You still haven't answered the question of, is it reasonable, rational, and logical to believe in God? Is God basically the same thing as Santa Claus, or the Easter Bunny, or unicorns, or leprechauns? So does God exist? Well, let's talk about a few things here. Before we get to the question of does God exist, I suppose we should ask, why does any of it exist? I assume, by the way, that we're not going to go out into the philosophical weeds together. I assume that you believe you exist. I think, therefore, I am. So, as long as we can all agree on that, we can move forward together on a philosophical basis, right? On a philosophical level, you believe that you exist, and I believe that I exist, and I believe the universe exists, and that it's not some kind of construct in the matrix or something silly like that, okay? So now that we've established that we all agree that we exist, we all agree that the universe exists, really the question is, why does it all exist? Going back to Dr. William Lane Craig, writing in reasonablefaith.org, he says, Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Why everything exists instead of just nothing? Typically, atheists have said the universe is just eternal, and that's it. But surely this is unreasonable. Just think about it for a minute. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions. For example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. This shows that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. And so here's what he's saying. Infinity is nowhere to be found in nature. You can't find infinity. Infinity is just an abstract thought. That's it. There is no such thing as infinity plus 10,000 or infinity times infinity, the way that like kindergartners talk to each other. Infinity doesn't actually exist. We recognize mathematically, philosophically, and scientifically that it is a finite universe with finite energy and finite mass and finite space. Infinity doesn't actually exist anywhere. Because like the writer says, like Dr. Craig says, and like mathematicians agree with, infinity is self-contradictory. If you try to look for it in the universe, infinity is self-contradictory. And so everything has a cause. Everything is an effect of some cause. On a biological level, for example, just to simplify it, you are an effect of a cause. You exist because your parents came together and procreated. So you are the effect of a cause. But they are themselves the effect of another cause. And their parents are the effect of a cause, and their parents are the effect of a cause, right? All of us on a biological level are the effect of some cause. That's also true of the way that things interact with each other on a molecular level. That's true of the way that energy interacts with other energy. That's true on a historical basis with historical events. There is no historical event that just happens in a vacuum. Everything from who you are as a person to the biological realities that surround us, to the way that molecules interact, to energy itself, everything is the effect of some cause. But if infinity is nowhere to be found in nature, then you can't go back in time in infinity. There are not infinite causes and effects. At some point, all of it boils down to one first cause. There had to have been an initial cause. We all agree that the universe exists. I think, therefore I am. I can feel things, and I believe on the basis of observation that it exists, that my universe, my environment exists. We all believe that the universe exists. We all acknowledge that the universe had to have had a cause. We all acknowledge that mathematically, scientifically, and philosophically, there are not infinite causes. That the universe is a caused thing. Something initiated the universe. We all agree with that. Given this conclusion, it necessarily follows that there was a first cause that was itself uncaused, eternal, and immaterial. But why, Ryan? Kind of seems like you're making a leap of faith there. Well, no, I'm not. Because here's the thing. If we all agree that there had to have been some first cause, some cause that initiated, that hit the dominoes and began the domino effect, right? If we all believe that there was some first cause, and again, mathematically and scientifically and philosophically, a first cause explanation is the most rational and reasonable and logical explanation for why the universe exists. But if we all believe in that first cause had to have been itself uncaused. Otherwise, it's not really a first cause. Because if the first cause, obnoxious finger quotes, if that first cause was caused, then it's not really the first cause. So the first cause had to have been uncaused. The first cause had to have been eternal, because if it's not eternal, then it existed in some pre-existent state, right? It had to have itself been timeless and eternal and outside the bounds of this existence, because time itself is a part of this existence, right? We are time-bound, we are temporal beings existing in a temporal universe. So the first cause had to have been uncaused. The first cause had to have been eternal, timeless, and the first cause had to have been immaterial as well, because all material things are the effect of some cause. The first cause couldn't have been created by something else. The first cause couldn't have been the result of some molecular interaction. The first cause could not have been the result of some biological interaction. The first cause had to have been uncaused. It had to have been eternal. It had to have been immaterial. As the physicist P.C.W. Davies explains, the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. That problem is also captured by Anthony Kenny of Oxford University. He writes, "A proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing. But surely that doesn't make any sense. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So why does the universe exist instead of nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being." God, as he's described in the Bible, as an infinite being, as a non-material being, a non-created thing, as a being that is timeless and spaceless and immaterial, a being that has incredible thought and incredible power. God, as he is described in the Bible, is the only logical, reasonable, rational explanation for a finite, material, and organized universe. Because any first cause would need to be fully existent outside of the constraints of this universe. From the very nature of the case, the cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being. It must be uncaused because we've seen that there cannot be an infinite regression of causes. It must be timeless, and it must be changeless, at least without the universe, because it itself created the universe and created time. Now, in future lessons, we're going to get into more explanation about why this makes sense. We're going to talk about what are some of the rational and reasonable explanations for God's existence. We're going to talk about some of the proofs of God's existence, the fine-tuning of the universe. We're going to talk about the moral argument. We're going to talk about how it is that we confront some of the questions from our atheist friends when it comes to belief in God. But I hope that you view this as the next step, right? This is the next block that we're putting down that's helping us to establish this reasonable, rational, logical, and deeply faithful belief in God's existence. Tune in next time while we get a little bit deeper into this subject. And as always, my friends, have a blessed day.